plans don't survive getting punched in the face for the first time or something like that. Like that's the same thing, right? You can build the model helps people get aligned, and then you go out in the real world and shit happens. And then you go figure out what to do next, but you have the context of the model to figure out. And that's true with high school students. It's true with, senior people within a company. You need this framework so that everyone's aligned.
Hey friends, Jeff here with a new episode of Conversations Life Science Leaders Aren't Having. Today we welcome Michael Chiu. Michael is the CEO of KitoPen, where they're based out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. What KitoPen is up to is developing a non-viral gene delivery platform that's going to support researchers and developers of drugs all over the globe to expedite the drug discovery process and expedite optimization. Who Michael is to me in the short time I've gotten to know him is builder. It is in his story, in his personal life, in his professional life. He came up through the professional ranks as an engineer working in the semiconductor space. Even early on in his story, he had thoughts and dreams of being an architect. He is a builder, and he has this uncanny ability to be able to build bridges from big ideas to then the question, well, what is it going to take to be able to do this or execute on it? I think you're really going to enjoy this podcast conversation with Michael Chiu. Michael Chiu, welcome. So glad to have you on the show. When we first talked, you were just days into your role, and so now we're 3 months later, and I've just been excited. I love early days of talking to CEOs, working with them. So I've been just really looking forward to our time together today.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeff. Thanks for inviting me on. This is kind of a neat experience and introduction to the industry. So I appreciate your interest in me and KitoPen.
Awesome. Yeah. I just did a brief introduction of you and who you are to me. Why don't you start us off and let us know what you're up to in the world?
Great. So I think, as you said in your intro, I'm new to KitoPen. I'm just kind of entering my 4th month here. I came out of another life science startup, Irby Biosystems, and that was my intro to life sciences. Prior to that, I was more in hardware tech, semiconductors, and so on. So I'm honestly just figuring things out. I have a good basic understanding of the biology and how things work, but boy, it's great to have a sharp team under me who can keep me in line and teach me what I need to know about KitoPen and our customers and what they're doing. And so that's right now. I like to say I'm kind of mapping and figuring out how my new world works, and as part of that, I'm trying to build a model in my head of how I think KitoPen should go forward, given the way the world works and the resources we have and the needs of our customers.
I'm curious. What is, if you were to tell somebody your methodology in this mapping process, and what's that look like for you? What's that approach like when you're in those early days and you're, as you called it, doing that mapping?
I don't know if I have a specific approach. I would just say that I can't. It's hard for me to function unless I have a rational model in my head, right? And so most of what I do, at least in these early stages of new ventures, is I'm trying to learn as fast as I can. I interview people, I talk to them, and I sort of say, what's your model of the world? And typically people have a really good sense of what they're supposed to do in their domain, and sometimes you have some people who have a good sense of how things work across multiple domains, and within KitoPen there are several people who've really got a good sense of the big picture, but sometimes people are missing key pieces of data or the key pieces of experience. And so, in talking with them, I'm trying to take everyone's perspective. I assume, and it's true, everyone's smart and thoughtful about what they're doing. But when you put all of those views together, they don't line up. They never line up, right? And if you connected all the dots, it wouldn't draw a picture that sort of leads to a path where there's success. And in some sense, that doesn't surprise me. That's partly why, the company has taken a shift in the CEO and to sort of figure out what that next set of steps are, right? So the things that the company has done in the past, they've been very successful, but they may not be the things you need to do in the future. And so we got to figure out, what are the goals for the future? What are the steps we need to take, and what changes do we make? And that to me, that's a mapping process. It's imperfect, and you never have a perfect map of exactly where you need to go, but it's a combination of the pure analytics of getting these puzzle pieces to fit together, and at the same time, building consensus among your team, because everybody came into it with a different view. And some of their views are strongly held, some of them are not strongly held, but they all kind of have the same desire. Like someone, or we as a team need to figure out what is the path forward that we all can get behind. And so that to me is, I don't know if there's a process there, but I have to get to that point, because if I don't have that clear view, it's very hard for me to go back to the team and say, listen, we all got to work really hard to take that hill, and if I'm not sure that's the place we need to go, it's really hard to ask people to pour themselves into a problem, myself included.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by that listening process. You call it a process, listening. I'm a person as a coach that loves the question. I'm wondering, is there a go-to question that you love to ask people as you're hearing perspective, seeing how they see the world? I'm wondering if there's a question that you like to go to, or a version of a question that is a go-to for you.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a specific question. I think typically, it's best to go into these, acknowledging your ignorance and asking people to, explain how they see the world, right? So, because if you go in there and say, "Tell me about X," you're assuming they know about X, right? Yeah. And you assume that X is their job, and then they're stuck kind of flat-footed to try and explain something that may not be the thing that's on their mind. And so, a simple example would be, tell me what you do. What is your job? How does your job work? Right? Where do you see the problems? What doesn't make sense? Those sorts of things. When I'm interviewing people, my opening question usually is like, why are we talking today? What do you know about the company, and why does it make sense for us to talk? And let them describe the way they view the world, because I'm less trying to interrogate them and more trying to figure out whether there's a map that makes sense with that person in it. And so I need to understand how they view the world and where their skills and weaknesses are.
Yeah.
So same is true in this mapping process for my engagement with Kaidopen. There's a lot of smart, talented people that do things that are valuable, but until I really understand what they do and how they do it, and how the pieces fit together and where the gaps are, there's really no point in sort of trying to manage them in a sense, right?
Yeah, I love that question. I don't know that as a coach I've ever asked that, but I really love the question, how do you see the world? And you may ask it a different way, depending on the context and the person, but the spirit of that question, how do you see the world? Just, yeah, it's so open, and it helps you. What I'm sensing is just helps you level set, and then can connect the dots or put the puzzle pieces together. It's really a powerful question. I love it. We're gonna have a chance to get to know Kaidopen and you, and in that larger context. Yeah. One thing we like to do here is also get to know the heart of the person. And a question that we don't often get asked, we get asked, what do we do? a lot, but what
Yeah.
we don't get asked a lot is, or maybe ever, is what do you love? What do you love, Michael?
Yeah, I mean that's a loaded question. I'll say, you know, where does my mind go? Like what do I do when I'm not, worried about work or family or whatnot? I guess at the highest level, I just like to build things, right? I'm trained as an engineer. I think of myself as being naturally analytic. I actually started out studying architecture. I liked architecture because it is in itself a mapping process, right? You have some objective function that you're trying to solve, and you've got some constraints, and you're trying to figure out, if I make the kitchen bigger, the living room is going to actually get smaller. I've got a budget, and you also get to put a little bit of your personality into it from the sort of the style and the flair of the decisions you make. So, that's kind of where I am, sort of, in my mind. I'm not a big idea person. I have several people I've worked with over time who are big ideas persons, and I'll sort of jokingly say I'm the filter, and I figure out which of those big ideas is interesting, and then I go implement them, right? And I find I'm most motivated when I work at this interface between sort of the concept, the big picture, and the implementation. I can, in my past, I've done the grinding details, but that interface for me between concept, which is concept says, what would great look like, whether we can do it or not, right? That's an interesting question. It's imaginative. And then there's, what is it actually going to take to be great? And it's practical. When you sit at that interface, there's a lot of creativity there, because if you don't come to it with a sort of a creative mind of, if you don't know what great is, then your motivation to be creative and push boundaries isn't there.
Yeah.
But if once you have that view, then you say, well, what would it take to get there, and what boundaries are you willing to break or push? Like, that's fun. Um, that to me is a very creative process. It's a bit of engineering, it's a bit of architecture, and it's a bit of design. So
Yeah.
it just happens to not be in the housing market. It's in problem solving.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where my mind goes. I get great pleasure out of that. Seeing, having someone give me a vision of something, big picture idea that it does something great, and not knowing how to do it, like the transformation from going from a great idea but not knowing how to do it, to having a plan, even if the plan's imperfect, even if it is high risk, it feels like something was created there, and that gives me great pleasure, right? But it's like, I kind of say it's a bit of my German side. I brought order to the world, and so I can relax a little bit. So outside of kind of pen, this manifests itself in many ways. In work, it's sort of a strategic thing. From a hobby point of view, I'm an old house guy, so I'm always trying to figure out how to build, make my house more efficient by building cabinets or whatever, or rooms to better match my needs. And civically, I'm quite engaged and figuring out how to build community organizations. My favorite right now is robotics teams in high school. So it's a great big idea of how to sort of teach kids both technical skills that help them in the future, but more importantly, kind of build the next generation to think about big, complex problems, not just technical ones, organizational ones, and societal ones, through the structure of robotics. So that's kind of where I put a lot of my time. A lot of fun, right?
Yeah. It's such a cool it's such a cool picture, and I'm always curious, how do you, maybe the kids that are in robotics, or the engineers and the scientists at Kaido maybe there's a natural inclination to that, but how do you teach that? How do you teach somebody to start thinking about building the bridge from idea to, well, what is it going to take, and then doing it? What are the building blocks to imparting that sense, or that to others?
I mean, I I think it depends on the person largely, but you know, if I talk about high school students, right, which is a great microcosm because they aren't pre-trained, right? You know, they're super creative and they've got big ideas. Um, and I think the worst thing you can do is tell them the answer, right? They say, "How do I do this?" And you say, "Well, you do it this way." You haven't achieved anything, right? Because the goal they're trying to solve really isn't all that important, right? It's, you know, whether, like, for example, we built a fully automated robot that makes s'mores, right? You push a button, it has a little oven, it has robots, moves marshmallows around, and you get a little s'more out. You know, the act of designing and building it, you know, it's fun and I can do it. But the real value was the students figuring out how to do it and, you know, doing it wrong and having it not work and having them be frustrated and then learning through failure, because there is no failure in that because it's an unimportant problem. But by the time they get done, they've learned that the thing they thought wasn't possible could be possible if you think about it a different way. You redefine the problem. You learn about the existence of something you didn't realize existed, and therefore, you know, sometimes problems have already been solved. You just need to go out and find it. Sometimes you need to redefine a problem to get the outcome you want, and sometimes you just, you know, you have to think about, distill down what are you really trying to achieve, and some, you know, oftentimes people are solving problems that aren't what they really want. And so teaching that thought process, but teaching it through letting people kind of run far enough ahead so they trip and fall, but not hurt themselves. Like in dealing with high school students, I think that's the way that I approach it, for right or wrong, right? And I think whether the students enjoy that or not, I think they get a lot of benefit out of it, right?
Yeah.
And they learn.
Yeah. How do you, because you kind of alluded to with the students, they're not pre-biased or trained, like they're pretty raw material.
Mm-hmm.
As you think about your work with professionals, you know, engineers, scientists who are naturally creative and builders themselves, but they have a lifetime, depending how old they are, of training of how things should go.
Yeah.
How do you help somebody who's got that lifetime of, you know, brick and mortar? How do you help break that down to help them start to see this creative bridge building process?
So I mean, that's predicated on the assumption that they don't already know better than me. But usually in my mind, it's a framing of the problem, right? I mean, you have to assume the people you're working with are smart and know how to do their job better than you know how to do it. And so to the extent you're not getting the results you need, it's often because you're misaligned on what the right outcome is, right? It's not that they're not doing a good job. It's not that they're not working hard. It's that you have not, you meaning the group and not the individual, has not really gotten aligned at what outcome we're trying to achieve. And so having that hard conversation, you know, are we driving revenue? Are we driving customer satisfaction? Are we driving, you know, utilization? What is the thing? Are we trying to save money, right? What is the thing that you know, or the weighted set of things we're trying to achieve? And you know, if we were to be purely quantitative and analytic, how would we model this so that we can measure whether we're aligned, right? I mean, I'm naturally a quantitative analytic guy. I mean, most of my life is run off of Excel, but I'm also not confused that Excel is not the truth. Excel is a proxy, a lens through which to look at what you're trying to achieve, so that when you do achieve something, you can compare it to your model and say, okay, there's a difference between the two. Is it because my model is wrong, or is it because my performance is wrong? And you can have that conversation.
Yeah.
So we talked about this kind of before the call about, you know, planning, right? You know, I think your quote was a Tyson quote, you know, plans don't survive getting punched in the face for the first time or something like that. Like that's the same thing, right? You can build the model helps people get aligned, and then you go out in the real world and shit happens, and then you go figure out what to do next, but you have the context of the model to figure out, and that's true with high school students. It's true with, senior people within a company. You need this framework so that everyone's aligned.
I have this sense that these ideas that you they've been building over a lifetime, a career, a lifetime. In this quote by John Ruskin, the highest reward for what we do, for our toil, is not what we get, but who we become. I'm wondering, who have you become? If you were to name that for who sits in front of me today, who have you become?
You gave me a preview of this question. Full disclosure, I didn't know how to answer it. I asked one of my colleagues, my HR person here, and her suggestion, which I both like and hate, is was weakness oriented. Right, I'm weakness oriented, and I've said that term in the context of Kaitapen many times. This came from my first. I came out of a company called Teradyne in the semiconductor world, and they were early into TQM. I think they had a great management perspective, but I remember being very frustrated. I would go prepare some plans. I would have some proposal. I'd be very proud of it. I'd put it in front of my manager, and he'd find all the flaws in it, right? And I sort of, frustration. I said, listen, you didn't, you haven't said anything nice about it. And he goes, like, what's the value? Like, good job, right? Thank you. But what's the value of me saying all the nice things? You already know that they're good, right? My job is to sort of, think of it as lowering the level of water in a stream to find where the rocks are. You put all this time into this thing. You don't want to fail. My job is to go figure out where there may be weakness and then help you, improve on that. So I really liked, I think sort of interpersonally, it kind of sucks, right? But if the people you work with trust you, I think it's a great orientation, because he was saying to me, listen, I trust you, right? You've got a great plan, right? You put your heart into it. You want to win. My job is to help you win. But let's go find out where you might not, and let's go address those sorts of things. And so, kind of I'm naturally optimistic, right? But I think that the sort of the weakness orientation is a very, in some ways, a very powerful way of thinking of things, as long as people can trust you and people understand the intent behind it. It's not meant to be critical. It's meant to be constructive. And so, I'm not sure if that's who I've become, but it is the way my mind works. And I kind of have my fingers in lots of things, and I typically am the person who is looking for faults in things. But hopefully not in a way that people perceive as just being the jerk, right?
Well, it's an interesting dichotomy. You just named yourself as an optimistic person, and this weakness, as you called it, this orientation around weakness or risk. Yeah, it's an interesting dichotomy. What's that experience like for you of being both weakness oriented and an optimistic person?
Oh well, it's frustrating on a personal level, because, like I said, I'm always the person who kind of has to be the sad sack, who has to kind of say, okay, great, that if we follow the happy path, this is going to be awesome. But let's talk about what's going to go wrong. People don't want to talk about what's going to go wrong. They want to talk about what a happy path looks like. And so and then in the end, when you do go address those risks and you do get the result that everyone's hoping for, I'm not looking for credit, but no one comes back to you and says, hey, great job. Thanks for pointing out all the things that could have gone wrong and making me fix them. And now I have this great result. They say, look, I got a great result. And it's like, awesome. We got a great result, right? And we all want the great result. So that's the reward. But it's to me personally, it feels like a sort of unsatisfying role to be in, but a very important one,
Yeah.
right? And again, it kind of goes back to like I need a model, and so if you give me a plan and I don't understand the model behind it, I'm going to start constructing one. And if the model in my head has holes, then I got to figure out how to plug those holes because I want you to be successful.
Yeah. That leads me to this question around the name of the show.
Mm-hmm.
Conversations life science leaders aren't having. And you bring a very unique perspective to that question because of your background. You are not a lifetime life sciencer. You're an engineer, semiconductor world, and found your way into the life sciences more recently in your professional path. I'm wondering, given that history, what is your response to that phrase, conversations life science leaders aren't having?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to frame it the same way you did, which is I'm not a scientist, and I'm relatively new to the sector. Right? I guess I'd say the closest description to me is a sort of robotics engineer. Um, my sense is that the industry as a whole is driven by science, and it's driven by science and the promise of these great patient outcomes, right? This is that big picture, like, what does success look like? And there's a lot of really, really hard and risky work in the science, right? And I don't even begin to try and estimate that. Um, and there's a lot of really good thought around the science and clinical work and patient safety and efficacy. Like when I'm continually amazed at how complicated biology is relative to engineering. So I'm very humbled by that. And I'm also amazed by how deep the science is and how much people understand. But on the flip side, that the actual operations of getting these therapies to patients, right? So the science is figured out. Now I've got 100,000 people with this particular disease. How do we actually get the therapy to them? Can they afford it? Can we manufacture it? Can we deliver it? There is also a lot of good work in that, but it also seems like that's pushed to the end, right? We're scientists. We got to figure out the hard science problem. We'll get to the logistics piece eventually, and it's not a wrong approach because, of course, if the science ultimately doesn't work, why did you waste your time in the logistics? But at the same time, maybe as an industry, because that's an area where you could siphon off a little bit more of the upfront money and figure out how to get those pieces figured out. Manufacturing therapies in volume, particularly these autologous therapies, is going to be it's going to be a challenge as these therapies start to get deployed, right?
Mm.
So there is a lot. I don't want to diminish the folks who are working on that, but that's where my mind goes, right? I'm surrounded by scientists who understand the front end stuff. Kytopen itself is sitting, we make a tool that is definitely useful in discovery, but ultimately is something that's going to hopefully transform, how therapies are made, particularly non-viral therapies, and we have to figure out. I have to map, what that ultimate supply chain and manufacturing process looks like, and it feels like it's not quite as well thought out as the front end.
Bring us into the very practical. Maybe conversations that you're having with your team as you've been mapping this process and getting inculcated in at Kytogen or Kytopen. What are those conversations like for you about the stuff that will naturally come later, but you're thinking about now?
Well, I think in that, we're still we're still pretty early in the sense that we don't have equipment that's in GMP manufacture yet. We're working with customers who are developing their therapies, right? So it's we're probably committing the same sin that I commented to everyone else. Is like we're focused on the near term stuff because what's the point of working on the long term if you don't have the near term figured out? But to me, um, the solution for a company like Kaidopen is primarily sort of customer intimacy, right? We don't know, maybe nobody quite knows what the future is going to look like. We're not going to figure it out sitting in our building and talking to ourselves. We're going to figure out, by finding customers who are at the forefront of this, customers who have problems that we can potentially address, and then figure out how, grab onto that customer, and don't let go. Like solve their problem. It may not be the problem we started with. It may be that as we learn more, their needs are slightly different. But if we're going to be successful over the long term, we're going to have to learn and figure that out. And what better way to do it than work with an actual customer and solve their actual problems? And then when you've been through, that fire with the customer, you can, at the end of it, you can sit back and reflect and say, okay, what did we learn? Based on what we learned, again, we had a model going in. We started working with a customer for a reason. We went through this process. We were successful, but the results are different than the model. How do we adjust it? And is the customer unique, or is the customer that experience something that's indicative of where the future is going to go, and how do we change our model to adjust it, right? That's the best I can do, because I would say I clearly am not an expert on what the future is for manufacturing cell therapies, and I'd argue there aren't many experts, if any at all, because it's evolving. So the most important thing is to have an organization that can learn and be responsive, but also, you have to put a few pins in your map, right, and take a few bets. And so pick a few customers, work with some leading folks, and really, drive hard to move it forward, because the future is going to be determined in part by what we do today. It's not foretold on the manufacturing side.
Yeah, and I'm coming back to that quote from Mike Tyson. Everybody's got a plan until they're punched in the mouth. In the mouth, yeah. It feels like in some ways you're speaking to that process. What are the conversations, whether it's weekly, monthly, you're having to assess the punches in the mouth, and then the pivot in how you're going to decide and approach what's next?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm early in, right? The first 3 months have been much more about learning and getting aligned on what we think our strategy needs to be in the near and midterm, right? So we've kind of finished that. We kind of know which direction we're going in, and it's really focused on customer intimacy, customer success, customer support. We've done a great job over the last 3-4 years building out a tech platform, building out products, being ready for GMP, having this really compelling sort of discover platform. And now we need to go get punched in the mouth, right? We need to go in front of customers and start working with them and find all the flaws in not the flaws in a product per se, but flaws in how we as an industry think about what success looks like and what's needed and so on. And so that's what we have to do, and we have to, we're building the organization to do that. We're aligning our organization so that we can be responsive to these customers and learn. And then most importantly, we're building the ability to collect the data, reflect, and adjust our model as we go along.
This is so funny, whether you talk about the robotics or in this case, going in front of a customer, and you said, well, let's go and get punched in the mouth. Mm-hmm. It feels like there's a reframing of this idea of failure. Who was it? Was it Thomas Edison said, well, I didn't fail 700 times. I just figured out 700 ways that this thing wasn't going to work. It feels like in your model, the frame, how you think about it is you're reframing failure. You're reframing that. And that's not always an easy thing, because no one goes and says, well, I'm going to go get punched in the mouth.
Yeah.
I'm gonna do everything I can so that I'm not punched in the mouth. If that mindset, how do you, whether it be now at Kaidopen or in past environments, how do you help people get comfortable with this new frame of failure?
Well, I mean, it's not failure, right? It's acknowledgement that you don't have a perfect model of the world, right? And it's acknowledgement that your view of success might be different than your counterparts, your customers' view of success. And so it's a learning experience. So there'll come a time when, there's a much more stable industry and a much clearer path for what needs to get done. And that's called commoditization, right? There'll be a day when some of these technologies are more commodities and it's all about execution and delivery. But that day isn't today. And so the thing we need to do is we need to position ourselves to be open and to learn and to support the customer, and then again reflect on structure the interaction with the customer so that we have the ability to learn and adjust, right?
Yeah.
And I would say one way to think about that is you can imagine a scenario where we go to the customer and we say, listen, this is the product we have. It is the best product in the market. You should use it and you're going to be successful. And here's the price. Just buy it, right? That generates revenue, and maybe they bite, and maybe they're successful, maybe they're not. But the only thing we got out of that transaction was money, right? And not that money isn't a good thing, but at this stage of the industry for Kaidopen, we're trying to, make sure we can maximize the benefit and the value for the customer in this area. And oftentimes the customers don't know what they need. And so I'd much rather go to the customer and say, listen, we have this transformational technology. It works really well in these areas. Here's the data. You're doing something very similar, but of course, you're not doing the same thing that this other customer is doing. Because if you were, you wouldn't be, you wouldn't have a business, right? They're already doing it. And so what is it about your unique problem? And your problem could be technical, could be organizational. It could be that, you just need to get the product to a certain point and then you're going to transfer it to some other organization. Whatever it is, how do we help you get to that next step? And it's going to be, our tools are, our platform and our technology, but it's also, our talented scientists and applications engineers, our creative people on how to engage people in business and so on. So there's this stage of Kaidopen, we've got this really powerful platform. We're trying to figure out what is the most valuable way to get it into the hands of our customers so we can make it succeed. And that's, I think it's about framing the problem. Right.
Yeah. I love that. Michael, this has been really just so insightful for me. I've grown as a coach just listening to you. I'd love to end us on the last question we ask all our guests is, you get a magic wand and we get to wave it over every life science CEO around the globe. And with that wave, you're planting the seed for one conversation that they're going to have over the next 7 days. What's the one conversation you would love every CEO to have with their teams over the next 7 days?
I don't, I guess I've said this before, getting therapies to patients is more about than just figuring out the science. The phrase in my mind, that I go to in many situations is sort of begin with the end in mind. Like what ultimately are we trying to achieve, whether it's, long-term curing cancer or over the next month hitting this milestone. What is, do we agree on what the critical end goal is? And are we organized, are we motivated to go achieve that? And then sort of the next half of that question is how do we do it better or faster, right? Whether it's achievable or not, let's at least understand what it could be and then decide whether or not to go do that. And so I think that was one thing I learned from a coaching exercise is sort of this question of like, how do I do it twice as fast? And you kind of give an answer. And then you say, okay, do it twice as fast after that. Maybe you get a little more creative. And then, how do I do it 10 times faster? And then you have to break all sorts of assumptions and you figure it out. And then you decide, now that you're, 800 times faster, am I willing to do that? Does that match my business? Maybe not, but you might end up being only 100 times faster, which is still 100 times faster than where you started had you not asked that question. And so, I guess my answer to you is evolving. It's like what does better look like, and why aren't we doing it? Might be a great question. Maybe the answer is there's a good reason why we're not doing it, but if we don't understand what better looks like, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's a great question. I'm going to add that one myself again to my quiver as a coach. Thank you so much, Michael. If folks are interested in learning more about KaidoPen or about you, where can we send them?
First of all, go to kaidopen.com. I think it'll probably be in your show notes, right? My plug is we have a really innovative, non-viral flow transfection process that helps you move faster in discovery, faster in translation, from clinic to manufacturer, and as higher volume manufacturer. We're excited to work with people who see value in that, and connect me on LinkedIn. Right, I'd love to meet people. I'm like I said, relatively new to the industry, and I'm just fascinated by everything in this industry. There's now everything I look at has 10 more layers of depth than I even imagined. So
that's so good. Well, this has been a real gift. Appreciate it. As you said, we'll put all that information in the show notes. Thanks so much, Michael. Really
great. Thank you, Jeff. It's been great. A lot of fun.